Warsaw, the first week of August 1944. A Polish Home Army fighter lies flat in the rubble of a barricaded street, watching a small tracked machine crawl toward him with 60 kilograms of high explosive in its nose, and no driver anywhere inside it. He is not holding an anti-tank weapon. He is holding a pair of wire cutters. Trailing behind the machine, across the cobblestones, is the thin steel cable that tells it what to do, and he is about to lean out and cut it. Everything that follows, the wreckage on the Seine, the factory in Bremen, the streets of Warsaw, exists to explain how the most advanced weapon of its kind in the world was stopped by a man with hand tools. To understand how a home army fighter with a hand tool defeated a German robot in the streets of Warsaw, you have to start with a wrecked French prototype that the German army pulled out of the River Seine in the autumn of 1940. And before we follow that wreck out of the river, one quick thing, because it belongs right here, in the quiet part before the story really starts. The battle ledger exists for one reason. People who care about these stories stay with them, all the way to the end. If that sounds like you, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe. That is the whole ask. It is how this channel finds the next forgotten weapon worth an episode, and the next one after that. So, the autumn of 1940, and a wrecked machine coming up out of the bed of the Seine. In the months after the fall of France, German ordnance teams went through the wreckage of the French military with a great deal of care, and among the things they recovered was a miniature tracked vehicle designed by a French engineer named Adolphe Quégres, who had spent part of his career building tracked cars for the last Tsar of Russia. Quégres's little machine was unmanned. It was designed to crawl across a battlefield under remote control, carry an explosive charge to an enemy position, and detonate. The German Ordnance Office looked at what they had pulled out of the river, recognized the principle at work, and, drawing at least in part on what they had recovered, handed a similar concept to the Karl Borgward Automobile Works in Bremen, with an instruction to build something that could carry at least 50 kilograms of high explosive. What Borgward delivered in the spring of 1942 was a tracked vehicle about the size of a household bathtub. It was 1.5 meters long, just over half a meter tall, and it weighed around 370 kilograms. The German army gave it the designation Sonderkraftfahrzeug 302, the Special Purpose Vehicle 302, and the cover name Leichter Ladungsträger, the light charge carrier. The soldiers who used it, and the Allied soldiers who would later encounter it, called it the Goliath. It was, by any reasonable definition, a robot, and in 1942, no army on Earth had ever sent one into combat. What the Goliath was, stripped of the cover name and the special purpose designation, was the first unmanned ground combat vehicle ever mass-produced and sent to war by any nation. It was the direct ancestor of every bomb disposal robot, every reconnaissance crawler, and every remote weapons platform that the armies of the world field today. And its combat record was very close to a complete failure. Across 3 years, 4 major fronts, and 7,500 vehicles built, the Goliath achieved almost nothing of tactical significance. It was too slow, too fragile, too expensive, and too easily stopped. The single most effective countermeasure against the most advanced unmanned weapon in the world, in 1944, turned out to be a soldier with a sharp hand tool and the nerve to use it. The Goliath failed at almost everything it was built to do. And then, 80 years later, every modern army on Earth started building its descendants. The Goliath was controlled by a cable. This single design decision explains most of what went right and almost everything that went wrong with the entire program, so it is worth being precise about how it worked. Trailing out of a drum in the rear compartment of the vehicle was a triple-strand cable, 650 meters long. 2 of the 3 strands carried the steering signals, left and right and forward, from a joystick control box that the operator held while lying in cover. The 3rd strand carried the firing signal that detonated the charge. The early version, the 302, was driven by 2 electric motors, which made it quiet but also expensive, because each vehicle cost around 3,000 Reichsmarks, and the electric drive was difficult to maintain and recharge anywhere near a battlefield. Borgward replaced the electric motors in the later Sonderkraftfahrzeug 303 with a small 2-cylinder Zündap petrol engine, which was cheaper and more robust, and which let the later vehicles carry a heavier charge of around 100 kilograms. Either way, the Goliath crawled toward its target at a top speed of around 10 kilometers an hour, barely faster than a man on foot. And it did so while paying out a steel cable behind it across whatever ground lay between the operator and the target. The intended use was straightforward enough. A combat engineer would steer the Goliath across no man's land toward a tank, a bunker, a strong point, or a section of barbed wire, put the vehicle against the target, and trigger the charge, destroying the target and the Goliath together. Each one was disposable. It was a guided bomb that drove, and the man who guided it never had to leave cover. On paper, that was a genuine tactical revolution. In practice, the paper had not accounted for the battlefield. The Goliath's armor was 5 millimeters of mild steel, enough to stop a rifle splinter and nothing more. So any artillery fragment, any heavy machine gun burst, any anti-tank rifle could disable it before it ever reached its target. Its ground clearance was small enough that a curbstone, a shell crater, a fallen beam, or a patch of soft mud could strand it completely. And then there was the cable, lying exposed on the ground for the entire length of the vehicle's run. Cut the cable, and the most advanced weapon of its kind in the world simply stopped in the open and waited to be collected. The Goliath first went into action near Sevastopol in the summer of 1942 and was issued from then on to specialized panzer and combat engineer units on every front the Wehrmacht fought on. The reports that came back were consistent, and they were not good. At Anzio, in the spring of 1944, the Goliath sent against the Allied beachhead achieved very little, disabled by artillery fire, or simply bogged down in ground a tracked bathtub could not cross. On the Normandy beaches that June, a number of Goliaths were positioned to be sent against the landing craft, and most of them never moved at all because the Allied naval and air bombardment that preceded the landings had cut their command cables where they lay, before a single operator could send a signal down them. The weapon that was supposed to attack the invasion was disarmed by the bombardment that opened it. It was in Warsaw, though, in August and September of 1944, that the Goliath met the enemy who understood it best. When the Polish Home Army rose against the German occupation, the Germans sent Goliaths into the narrow, barricaded streets of the city to break the insurgent strongpoints. And the Home Army fighters, watching these machines crawl toward their barricades, worked out very quickly what the long, thin cable trailing behind each one had to be for. They learned to let the Goliath come, to stay in cover, and to get a blade onto the cable. A severed cable turned the vehicle into an inert steel box sitting in the street, still loaded with its charge, which the insurgents could then strip for explosive that the chronically undersupplied Home Army needed badly. The German robot became a delivery service, bringing high explosive directly to the resistance, free of charge. Across the whole war, around 7,500 Goliaths were built, at considerable cost in money, in factory capacity, and in the labor of a German war economy that by 1944 had neither to spare. The return on that investment, measured in tanks knocked out and positions destroyed, was so small that it is difficult to find a single engagement in which the Goliath made a decisive difference. As a weapon, it was one of the most comprehensive failures of the German war effort. And yet, the idea inside it was not a failure. The idea inside it was simply early. Everything that was wrong with the Goliath was a problem of its era, and not a problem of its concept. The vehicle was slow because petrol and electric drives in 1942 were not powerful enough for its weight. It was fragile because lightweight armor did not yet exist. And it was tethered to that fatal cable for one reason only, which is that reliable, jam-resistant battlefield radio control, small enough to fit inside a vehicle the size of a bathtub, had simply not been invented yet. Every one of those problems was solved in time by the second half of the 20th century. Radio control became reliable and small. Electric drives became powerful. Cameras shrank until an operator no longer needed to see the vehicle with his own eyes. And once those problems were solved, the concept the Goliath had proved, a machine that carried danger toward the enemy while the human being who controlled it stayed safely out of reach, turned out to be one of the most valuable ideas in modern warfare. The British Army, fighting a long campaign against improvised bombs in Northern Ireland, developed a small remote-controlled tracked vehicle called the wheelbarrow to approach and disarm explosive devices, so that a human operator never had to. The wheelbarrow saved a great many lives, served for decades, and was finally replaced in 2019 by a far more capable robot called the T-7. The American military, fighting roadside bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan, fielded thousands of tracked bomb disposal robots. The Talon, the PackBot, the man-transportable robotic system, every one of them a direct conceptual descendant of the machine the Wehrmacht had crawled toward the barricades of Warsaw. The armies of the present day field unmanned ground vehicles for reconnaissance, for mine clearance, and for direct combat. And the war between Russia and Ukraine has put tracked ground robots, carrying explosives toward enemy positions under remote control, back onto the front line of a major war for the first time since 1945. Every one of those machines is doing what the Goliath was built to do. The difference is that the radio link the modern machines rely on cannot be stopped by a fighter leaning out of cover with a blade. The Goliath was not a bad idea. It was a correct idea, fielded 25 years before the technology existed to make it work, against an enemy clever enough to find the one weakness the concept could not yet design away. The Allies defeated the world's first combat robot by cutting a wire, because in 1944, the wire was the one part of it that could not be made to disappear. Return for a moment to that home army fighter in the rubble of a Warsaw street in August of 1944, lying still with a pair of wire cutters in his hand, while a German robot crawls toward his barricade. He is not looking at the future of warfare, although that is what is grinding toward him on its little tracks. He is looking at an immediate practical problem, and he has found the answer to it, and the answer is the thin steel cable trailing across the cobblestones. He does not know that the machine in front of him is the ancestor of weapons that will still be fighting wars 80 years later. He does not need to know. He only needs to know that the thing has a wire, and that he has a blade, and that for one more day, on one more street, that is still enough. The world's first war robot was beaten by a man with a hand tool, and then it quietly became every war robot that followed. That closes the Goliath file on the battle ledger. Where we go next, we leave the barricades of Warsaw behind and step into another corner of 20th century weapons history where an idea arrived before the technology that could carry it and was written off as a failure by the people who built it long before the rest of the world worked out that they had been right all along. Another weapon ahead of its time. Another machine whose real career began only after its first one had ended. Subscribe and you will not miss it. Randy Shugert's rifle was a weapon his own army had tried to retire. The exploding rat was 100 dead rodents that never went off. The hedgehog was 24 British spikes that, when they worked, never gave the enemy the courtesy of a warning. The M1 carbine was a backup weapon that walked 1,000 miles behind enemy lines and changed what Americans expected from a rifle. The grease gun was the cheapest weapon the United States Army ever issued, and the one it could not bring itself to retire. The AR-18 was the rifle the world refused to buy, and then spent 30 years quietly turning into every other rifle it built. The Davy Crockett was a nuclear weapon whose lethal radius reached back to the men who fired it, and the United States Army built it anyway. The Fritz X was the world's first smart bomb, 25 years ahead of its time, and the first thing it sank was a battleship sailing to surrender. The Sturmgewehr 44 was the rifle Hitler personally banned, that his own army built in defiance of his order, and that armed every army on Earth for the next 80 years. And the Goliath was the world's first war robot, beaten by a man with a pair of wire cutters, and rebuilt by every modern army that came after him. All 10 did more damage than their makers ever planned for.